Shalom and welcome back to the Messiah Yeshua. I'm glad that you're here to learn the Word of God with us. Today we're diving into this week's portion, which is called Metzora. We'll focus on its wisdom, its beauty, and we'll see how it speaks to our lives right now. So together we'll look at passages from Leviticus 13:59 through 15:33, which will connect us to Isaiah 66:1 through 24, as well as Mark 9:40 through 50. And let's start with the Torah portion summary. So what is Metzora? Metzora means leper. A person diagnosed with leprosy is called a Metzora, and he enters a state of ritual impurity that forces him out of society. The Torah does not offer a cure for leprosy, but it does offer a procedure to purify a person who has recovered from leprosy, so that he or she can return to a state of ritual purity. The priest must examine the afflicted person to see if the leprosy has indeed left. If the priest is satisfied and the person's leprosy is gone, he conducts a strange ritual involving two birds, living water in a pot, a piece of cedar, a strip of scarlet wool, and a bunch of hyssop. The priest sprinkles the recovered leper with a blood and water mixture, after which the leper must shave, immerse, and shave and immerse again 7 days later. On the 8th day of his purification, he brings sacrifices to the temple to mark his purification. The officiating priest marks him with oil and touches the sacrificial blood to his right ear, right thumb, and right toe. A person's house can also be afflicted with leprosy. In this case, the leprosy takes a form of a type of mold or mildew infestation that spreads on the walls. A priest is summoned to inspect. If he determines the mark is leprous, an attempt at removing it is made, but if that fails, the house must be demolished. Human ritual impurity arises from a variety of other embarrassing discharges and issues. Some of these conditions render a person unclean. Others make a person both ritually unclean and contaminating. Some require purification offerings, but most can be resolved by immersing into a gathering of living water, that is, immersion in mikvah. So we'll focus on Metzora deeper. The 28th reading from the Torah is Metzora, a word that means leper, as we've discussed. So the word appears in the second verse of the reading, which says, "This shall be the law of the leper in the days of his cleansing," Leviticus 14:2. Leviticus 14 spells out the complex purification rituals for the cleansing of a leper and leper's home. Leviticus 15 briefly covers the laws regarding ritual unfitness stemming from bodily emissions. Except in biblical calendar leap years, Metzora is read together with the previous Torah portion, Tazria, on the same Sabbath. Wellspring of evil. This shall be the law of the leper in the day of his cleansing. Now he shall be brought to the priest. Leviticus 14:2. As we continue in Leviticus, the Torah is still worried about tumors, scabs, spots, and rashes. The previous Torah portion described in great detail the laws for diagnosing and quarantining lepers. A reader might wonder what this has to do with him, and why the Torah spends so much time on these details. Unless you are a son of Aaron serving in Levitical priesthood, the laws of diagnosing and purifying lepers don't have much application. The average person will never be responsible for distinguishing between one type of rash and another for purposes of declaring someone ritually unfit. Nevertheless, we learned in the previous Torah portion that the laws of biblical leprosy have spiritual applications. Traditionally, the rabbis have used these laws to teach about the grievous sin of evil speech, lashon hara. The association between evil speech and leprosy is derived from the story of Miriam's leprosy. Miriam was punished with leprosy for grumbling against her brother Moses. The sages inferred from this that biblical leprosy was a punishment for the sin of an evil tongue. Given that piece of information, the laws of leper Metzora became fertile ground for homiletic teachings about the sin of evil speech. The rabbis gave moral interpretations of the Torah's regulations for assessing leprosy and the laws for affecting purification. For example, the sages taught that the word Metzora, leper, is derived from a combination of the Hebrew word motzi, which means wellspring or source, and the Hebrew word ra, which means evil. Put them together and it spells the word leper, Metzora. Sort of. It's not a real etymology. The word Metzora actually comes from the Hebrew word for leprosy, which is zarat. The wellspring of evil explanation is meant as an illustrative reminder. What is the source from which evil springs? It is the tongue. Therefore, one who speaks evil is a spiritual Metzora. James, the brother of Yeshua, probably knew this interpretation. He alludes to it in his epistle where he compares the tongue to a wellspring. He says this, "From the same mouth come both blessing and cursing. My brethren, these things ought not to be this way. Does a fountain send out from the same opening both fresh and bitter waters?" James 3:10-11. The symptoms described by the Torah as zarat include various skin conditions and mildew-like cultures that appears in fabrics and on the walls of the houses. Most English versions translate zarat as leprosy. However, as mentioned in the comments of the previous Torah portion, the translation is misleading. Modern English speakers think of a leper as a person who has what is known as Hansen's disease, a severe disease that causes the nerves to malfunction so that one cannot feel pain. People afflicted with Hansen's disease routinely damage their body without being aware of it. Repeated injury and infection cause them to lose skin and even limbs, taking on the stereotypical look of a leper. This condition is different from the ailments of the Torah describes as zarat. For that reason, we use the term biblical leprosy to distinguish the affliction from Hansen's disease. So once again, biblical leprosy does not equal to leprosy. And we'll talk about cleansing the leper. "And the priest shall go out to the outside of the camp. Thus the priest shall look, and if the infection of leprosy has been healed in the leper," Leviticus 14:3. Leviticus 14 describes the procedure and rituals necessary for cleansing a person who has recovered from biblical leprosy. Their purification ceremony is not a cure for the disease. It is a cure for the ritual unfitness left behind by the disease. So even if a person had completely recovered from biblical leprosy so that not even a spot of the affliction remained, he was still ritually unfit. The disease might be gone, but the ritual unfitness caused by the disease remained. In the Gospels, Yeshua frequently healed people who had been diagnosed with biblical leprosy. When he did, he sent them to the priest to undergo the Leviticus 14 process. At the beginning of the chapter, the leper is still living in isolation outside of the camp or outside the city, waiting for symptoms of biblical leprosy to disappear. He is still mourning, wearing torn clothing, his face covered, and his hair unkempt. If his symptoms recede, he descends for a priest to examine him. The priest has to determine if the leprosy has indeed cleared. If it has not, then the man remains a leper. If it has, the priest begins the purification ceremony whereby the man can be returned to a state of ritual fitness and returned to society. The details of the ceremony are complex, and we can provide an outline that will help to summarize the process. So their purification process goes like this. Purification procedure stage 1, returning to the camp, which includes the priest obtains the necessary elements for the purification ritual: 2 live clean birds, branch of cedar wood, hyssop plant, crimson wool, and clay pot of living water, Ma'im Chaim. The priest slaughters one of the birds over the vessel of living water. He bundles the remaining elements together and dips them in the water and blood solution. He uses the package of elements to sprinkle the leper 7 times with the blood and water. He releases the live bird. The leper shaves off his body hair. The leper immerses himself in mikvah. of living water, washes his garments, full body immersion, and the leper may now return to the camp, but not to his home. Then we go into purification procedure stage 2, returning to the home. 7 days later, the leper again shaves his body hair. The leper immerses himself in mikvah of living water, washes his garments, again full body immersion. The leper may return to his house, but not to the sanctuary. And we go into the purification procedure stage 3, returning to the sanctuary. On the 8th day, the leper brings offering to the entrance of the sanctuary, 2 male lambs, female lamb, oil, flour. Then the priest offers a wave offering with lamb for a guilt offering, oil, and the priest sacrifices the lamb for the guilt offering. Blood is spilled to the altar. Some blood is retained for the cleansing. The priest applies the lamb's blood to the leper, right ear, right thumb, and right toe. Then the priest sprinkles some of the oil 7 times toward the Holy of Holies. And the priest applies oil to the leper, right ear, right thumb, right toe, smears remaining oil on the leper's head. The priest offers the rest of the leper's sacrifices, female lamb as a sin offering, male lamb as a burnt offering, and flour and oil as a grain offering. The leper is now completely ritually fit and free to participate in the sanctuary and sacrifices. So once again, it's a little bit complex, and I hope this picture paints it better for you and gives you a somewhat easier summary. The Torah briefly outlines a less expensive procedure to be used in the case of a leper without the means to supply all the necessary sacrifices. So instead of 3 lambs, the leper may bring 1 lamb for the guilt offering and live birds for the sin offering and burnt offering. The process employs a lot of peculiar symbolism. The sin offering sacrifices, the seder, scarlet wool, hyssop, sprinkling procedures, immersions, and living water are all employed in other purification rituals like the Day of Atonement in Leviticus 16 and the red heifer in Numbers 19. Maimonides, a rationalist, states that he could find no particular reason for the choice of these specific items and rituals. Rashi, on the other hand, follows the traditional teaching of the sages to offer some suggested interpretations. He points to a passage in the Talmud that explains that birds were used because leprosy was associated with evil speech. So according to Rashi, cedar wood was used because it came from a lofty cedar tree, a symbol of the haughty spirit of gossip. Rashi says that the red cloth was used because the red dye was extracted from a worm. The slanderer should humble himself and regard himself as lowly as a worm. He explains the hyssop the same way. Apparently, hyssop is a particularly humble plant. Rashi's explanations make good moral applications, but they are not completely satisfying. So different teachers and commentators interpret the symbolism in different ways. The chatterer. Then the priest shall give orders to take 2 live clean birds. Leviticus 14:4. So again, according to Rashi's suggestion, the birds were used in purification from leprosy because the leper represented someone who had committed the sin of evil speech. The Talmudic idea is that just as birds chatter, a person who speaks evil is also a chatterer. And it says this: what is it that makes a leper so unique that the Torah says in Leviticus 14:4, take 2 live clean birds so that he may become pure again? The Holy One, blessed be He, declared, since he did the work of a chatterer, therefore let him offer a chatterer as a sacrifice. And that's in B. Arachin 16b. Just because a person is talkative doesn't make him a sinner, does it? There's nothing wrong with being loquacious, is there? It's not that chattering is wrong, it's that chattering will inevitably lead to improper speech. The Proverbs say this: when there are many words, transgression is unavoidable, but he who restrains his lips is wise. And you can find that in Proverbs 10:19. Sitting around talking about nothing in particularly easily leads to talking about something inappropriate. I have often observed this phenomenon in my own behavior. It is easy to get drawn into conversation and too quickly to get carried away with your own rhetoric. Soon you find yourself saying things that you did not mean to say, revealing things that you should not have been revealed, and making remarks that should have been left unsaid. For some reason, it is always tantalizing to speak about others or to malign leadership. This is why the Apostle Paul warned us to avoid idle chatter. And he says this, but avoid mundane and empty chatter, for it leads to more and more ungodliness, and their speech will spread like leprosy. Here's again another comparison to leprosy, and that's in 2 Timothy 2:16 through 17. Yeshua warned us to avoid careless words. He told his disciples that their careless words would echo back on them in a final judgment. And he says this, but I tell you that every careless word that people speak, they shall give an accounting for it in the day of judgment. For by your words you will be justified, and by your words you will be condemned. And that's in Matthew 12:36 through 37. The haughty spirit. Then the priest shall give orders to take 2 live-clean birds and cedar wood, Leviticus 14:4. Rashi suggested that cedar wood was employed in purification ceremony because the cedar, as a tall and lofty tree, represents the haughty spirit. A haughty spirit finds it difficult to tolerate other people's character flaws. The haughty person fails to recognize his own shortcomings. Instead, he focuses on shortcomings of others. Most often, when we speak ill of others, it is because we are defending our own pride. Now, my father used to say that people try to elevate themselves by stepping on other people. By putting someone else down, we think we are lifting ourselves up. The Proverbs contrast 2 kinds of people: a person who guards his words and a person with a haughty spirit. And it says this, he who guards his mouth and his tongue guards his soul from troubles. Proud, haughty, scoffer are his names, who acts with insolent pride. Proverbs 21:23 through 24. The Psalms also equate haughtiness with evil speech. Psalm 101 warns that God punishes the slanderer and does not endure haughtiness. It says, whoever secretly slanders his neighbor, him I will destroy. No one who has a haughty look and an arrogant heart will I endure. Psalm 101:5. So the big, tall, haughty cedar is the most likely tree in the forest to be cut down. As the saying goes, the bigger they are, the harder they fall. Pride goes before destruction, and a haughty spirit before stumbling. And that's in Proverbs 16:18. The Bible says that God's eyes are on the haughty to bring them low. The metaphor of a cedar as a haughty person comes from the words of the prophet Isaiah. It says, the Lord of hosts will have a day of reckoning against everyone who is proud and lofty, and against everyone who is lifted up, that he may be abased. And it will be against all the cedars of Lebanon that are lofty and lifted up. Isaiah 2:12 through 13. So in our attempts to elevate ourselves by stepping on others, we inevitably lower ourselves. This is part of what Yeshua meant when he taught that if a man lifts himself up, he will be humbled. But if he humbles himself, he will be lifted up. Imagine yourself at the Sabbath table with friends from your community when your friends raise the topic of a person known to be an adversary of yours. Your friends begin to criticize your adversary's faults. How do you respond? It feels good to have your friends on your side, and the temptation is to join them in pointing out your adversary's flaws. It makes you look better, or does it? The higher path is to come to the defense of the person and quiet the criticism. When you show that kind of integrity and humility, it not only makes you look better, it makes you better. Once I've witnessed a tragic split in one of the ministries. 2 parties emerged. Both groups had reputations as godly people. Both seem to have legitimate grievances with the other. People affected by the split immediately began choosing sides. And people wondered who was in the right. Rather than choose sides, some people waited and listened. One of the parties spoke derisoriously about the other, making phone calls, voicing their grievances, and spreading stories. The other party never spoke an ill word about the former. Instead, they humbly maintained the tight reticence about the matter. That contrast was telling. The lowly worm. Then the priest shall give orders to take 2 live clean birds and cedar wood and a scarlet string. Leviticus 14:4. One of the components in the purification ritual is scarlet wool. The scarlet string of wool served the practical purpose for binding together the cedar and hyssop for the purposes of dipping and sprinkling in the purification ritual. The translation that a lot of people use, NASB, translates the Hebrew sheni tolat as scarlet string. The term could be translated as scarlet worm. It is so called because the scarlet dye used in the days of the Torah was derived from an invertebrate, in other words, a worm. Rashi suggests that this dye was used in purification ceremonies so that the gossipers and slanderers would remember to humble themselves like a worm. The original words of John Newton's famous hymn, Amazing Grace, are alleged to have said, "Amazing grace, how sweet the sound that saved a worm like me." Do you guys remember that? Until it was then later modified to a wretch like me. And nobody likes to think of himself as a worm, so the wording was changed to the more palatable "that saved a wretch like me." As the popular message of high self-esteem theology has taken hold in evangelical Christianity, people have grown less comfortable with thinking of themselves as wretches. The wording of the hymn has changed again. Many churches are now singing, "Amazing grace, how sweet the sound that saved such a one as I," or in some cases, "that saved and set me free." We have gone from being worms to being wretches to simply being saved and free. Were we better off as worms? Popular messages today teach a gospel of self-esteem. Have you guys realized it? They promote the idea that most of our problems and shortcomings are not really our own fault. Instead, they stem from the root problem of not regarding ourselves highly enough. To remedy the problem, we make excuses for our own sins while focusing on the ways in which others have wounded us. Most people today struggle with the problem of too much self-esteem. The psalmist identified himself as a worm. Paul identified himself as a wretch. If we had any notion of how loathsome our sins are before the holy God of Israel, we would regard being called a worm as a high praise. If we are not willing to see ourselves in such a lowly place, we will not be able to properly regret our sin or repent from it. Now we'll talk about the hyssop. Then the priest shall give orders to take 2 live clean birds and cedar wood and scarlet string and hyssop for the one who is to be cleansed. Leviticus 14:4. Rashi suggests that the hyssop plant was used in the purification ritual because it is a lowly, humble plant and therefore reminds the penitent gossip that he should have a lowly, humble spirit. That seems like a stretch, but Rashi has a good biblical basis for associating hyssop with lowliness. Hyssop grows in tufts of stems no larger than 1.5 feet. The Bible contrasts the hyssop against the cedar when it says, "Solomon spoke of trees, from the cedar that is in Lebanon even to the hyssop that grows on the wall." 1 Kings 4:33. So that puts the hyssop on the opposite end of the spectrum from the cedar. Rashi believed that the cedar was used to represent a haughty spirit. Hyssop is the opposite of setter. A person should try to be a hyssop and not a setter. Hyssop also has associations with purification because of the fragrance of its leaves. King David referred to hyssop's use in Levitical purification rites in Psalm 51 when he said, "Purify me with hyssop, and I shall be clean." And that's in Psalm 51:7. Over living water. The priest shall also give orders to slay the one bird in an earthenware vessel over running water. Leviticus 14:5. The purification ceremony involved the use of what the NASB calls running water. This translation creates a problem. The running water was supposed to be in an earthenware vessel. If the water was collected in an earthenware vessel, it was no longer running water. The Hebrew phrase behind the term running water is mayim chayim, which literally means living water. And the term living water refers to water from a natural source that has not been manipulated in plumbing or aqueducts or drawn from wells or cisterns. So rivers, streams, springs, and even rainwater are all forms of mayim chayim. In this case, the living water in the earthenware jug must have been collected from a living water source like a stream, river, or spring. The Torah requires living water for several purification rituals. All rituals immersions are to be done in living water. So a mikvah is a pool of water that qualifies purification because it also contains some quantity of living water. So when people, when these days they do something that is called baptism, which is actually immersion in the bodies of mikvah, it should be done in living waters. That's very, very important. And gospel readers remember the scene in which John the Immerser was immersing people in Jordan River. So likewise, Elisha told Naaman, the leper, to immerse himself in the Jordan River 7 times. A running river is a good source of living water. In Jewish thought, the Torah is sometimes referred to as living water because it revives us and keeps us fresh and spiritually clean. Yeshua uses the term living water to refer to his teaching and to the Spirit of God. After the birth ceremony was complete, the leper had to wash his clothing and immerse himself in living water. 7 days later, he immersed himself again. So immersions in living water are a part of all of the Bible's purification ceremonies. The Torah's ritual of immersing in living water is the origin, actually, of Christian baptism. Water is symbolic of and integral to the cleansing process. In Judaism, immersion into living water symbolizes a rebirth and return to the original purity of Eden. It is said that all living water has its source in Eden. Immersing in the living waters symbolically reconnects the human being with the innocence of Eden. Thus, it signifies spiritual regeneration. A house of leprosy. Then the one who owns the house shall come and tell the priest, saying, "Something like a mark of leprosy has become visible to me in the house." Leviticus 14:35. Leviticus 14:33 through 53 describes the ceremonial procedure for diagnosing and cleansing a home in which signs of biblical leprosy have appeared on the walls. Mold and mildew are not uncommon on interior walls. It can be a real problem in Israel during the rainy winter seasons. Mold and mildew, however, do not necessarily constitute biblical leprosy. Not every form of mold and mildew is leprous. As with the man who suspected he had contracted leprosy, the priest was to make an examination and diagnosis of the house. If the priest diagnosed the mildew problem as biblical leprosy, he declared the home ritually unfit. You may have mold and mildew problems in your house, and they may present you with health risks, but you don't need to worry about them being biblical leprosy unless a descendant of Aaron serving in the priesthood makes that assessment. The procedure for purifying such a house is similar to the procedure of purifying a leper. In both cases, the ritual with the two birds, the cedar wood, crimson, and hyssop, are identical. Furthermore, the shaving of the leper's hair can be compared to the scraping of the plaster from an afflicted house. The sages blame leprosy in a house on the words spoken with that house. Most of the evil speech we indulge happens within the four walls of our own homes. Our spouses are our confidants as we unburden our hearts to them, blow off a little steam, and lodge our complaints about others. This kind of murmuring seems innocent. There are no victims. The words never leave the house. So what's the problem? Actually, there is a victim. You are the victim. By indulging in critical speech, you are conditioning yourself to exercise a critical spirit. Day after day, you are patterning your mind to concentrate on the shortcomings of others. Moreover, you are poisoning the other members of your household with the same increasing bitterness. One could say that the very walls of your house absorb the evil spiritual energy you are creating. The entire home becomes defiled. The solution to the problem is to break the habit. Make a pact with those in your home not to speak or tolerate evil speech any longer. Scrape the infected spiritual plaster of the walls and start with a fresh coat of optimism, grace, and kindness. So, if it freshens up the place a bit, the following outline helps to summarize the procedure for a leper's house. Maybe it'll be, once again, easier for some people to understand. So if the house is suspected of leprosy, the priest is called to inspect the home, owners empty the house, priest goes in to examine the home. If the mark on the walls does not appear leprous, house is clean, no further action is required. If priest deems the mark on the walls potentially leprous, house is quarantined 7 days, no one can enter it. Priest returns after 7 days. If the mark has spread, affected stones are removed to unclean place outside the city. Plaster is scraped from interior of the house. Plaster is removed to unclean place outside the city. House is replastered. If the mark reoccurs, priest declares the house unclean. House is torn down. Debris is removed to unclean place outside the city. If the mark does not recur, house is clean, and the purification ceremony commences. The purification ceremony for the home, it starts with the priest who obtains the necessary elements for the purification ritual, so 2 live clean birds, branch of cedar wood, hyssop plant, crimson wool, and clay pot of living water. The priest slaughters one of the birds over the vessel of living water. He bundles the remaining elements together and dips them in a water and blood solution. He uses the package of elements to sprinkle the house 7 times with the blood and water. He released the live bird, and the house is clean. And that's about it for the explanation. Hope it makes some things easier for you to understand. And now we'll talk about gender and purity. Speak to the sons of Israel and say to them, when any man has discharge from his body, his discharge is unclean. Leviticus 15:2. So Leviticus 15 is not discussed much in sermons or church Bible studies. It is uncommon to hear the pastor of a church address his congregation about the ritual purity concerns of bodily discharges, emissions, and menstruation. These are uncomfortable and embarrassing topics that are not appropriate for discussion in a mixed gender context. Nevertheless, these two are matters of Torah and are meant to be studied and understood. So before we study these laws, it is essential to remember that these commandments apply primarily in the context of the temple. There are Levitical concerns governing who is fit or not fit to enter the temple, handle the sacred items, or eat from the sacrifices. Any implication of these laws on the community level outside of Judaism is probably a misapplication. So let me give you a few examples. I have heard Hebrew roots communities that prohibit women from attending their weekly services during menstruation or force them to sit on the floor lest they contaminate a chair. These types of misapplications betray a complete misunderstanding of the laws of ritual purity that is just not how it works. For the most part, the only time a person must be concerned about contracting a state of ritual impurity is when he or she is about to enter the temple or eat of its sacrifices. Since there is no temple and no sacrificial service in our day and age, most of these laws lack practical application. So let me dispel a common misconception about the application of purity laws. Visitors to an Orthodox Jewish community might notice that men and women do not shake hands. It's a custom that makes for several awkward introductions. One might mistakenly assume it's a concern over ritual purity status. That's not the case at all. Orthodox Judaism practices complete separation between unmarried man and woman, but that practice has nothing to do with ritual purity. It is a standard of sexual ethics called shomer negia, which means guarding touch. It is a safety fence that protects people from inappropriate contact. It sounds extreme to modern sensibilities, but the Orthodox Jewish world sees it as a healthy custom and a safeguard against adultery and sexual immorality. I've heard penitent adulterers testify that things began to go wrong for them with a handshake or a friendly embrace that lasted just a moment too long. The Shomer Negillah standard is not concerned with ritual purity. It has nothing to do with menstruation or ritual unfitness and should not be confused with purity laws. And in many cases, I certainly agree with this, because when people hug each other or handshake the opposite gender, remember, to you, it might be just an innocent handshake, but to them, it might mean something much more. And it all can start from just a single handshake. Ritual fitness for men. This, moreover, shall be in his uncleanness in his discharge, Leviticus 15:3. In the Hebrew of the Torah, a venereal type emission is called a zav. Experiencing a zav makes a man ritually unfit. Moreover, the man who has experienced a zav makes people and objects ritually unfit by simple contact. Anyone who touches the man who experienced the zav or any object that the man sat upon is immediately rendered ritually unfit. Before the person contaminated by a man with a zav can be ritually fit again, he must immerse himself in the living water or in the mikvah. Well, that's what it is, the mikvah, and wait until sundown. So before the man with the zav can be ritually fit again, he must count 7 days from the day of his last discharge. When he has had 7 days without a discharge, he is to immerse himself. On the 8th day, he is to bring 2 birds as a sin offering and a burnt offering to the temple for his purification and re-initiation into the worship. The sin offering is not brought for sin. It is for ritual purification. Normal sexual emissions also leave a man and his wife ritually unfit. Did you guys know that? This is another example of why the laws of fit and unfit should not carry a positive or negative association in our minds. Sexual relations with one's spouse is a good and healthy thing, yet it renders both husband and wife ceremonially unfit. To return to a ritual fit state, the person needs to immerse in water. So even though ritual unfitness is not a sin, these laws illustrate that sexual activity has the potential to be defiling. On a spiritual level, sexual activity defiles a person if it is practiced outside of the Torah's moral standards. The immoral man sins against his own body, and that's in 1 Corinthians 6:18. Now we'll talk about the nida. When a woman has a discharge, if her discharge in her body is blood, she shall continue to her menstrual impurity for 7 days, and whoever touches her shall be unclean until evening. Leviticus 15:19. Menstruation makes a woman ritually unfit. The Torah refers to a woman's period of menstruation and its resulting ritually unfitness as nida. The period of nida commences with the first show of menstruation and continues for 7 days. Even if her menstrual flow lasts only a few days, the Torah's laws still designate her as a nida for the full 7 days. During those 7 days, she is ritually unfit and makes people and objects ritually unfit by simple contact. As mentioned above, the contracting ritual unfitness is not a real concern in today's world. However, the Torah does have a serious moral concern about menstruation that still applies today. It is not a matter of ritual fitness, it is a matter of sexual morality. Leviticus 18:19 expressly forbids sexual relations with a woman in nida. You shall not approach a woman to uncover her nakedness while she is in her nida, uncleanness. Leviticus 19:18. And that's something really important to remember. That's one of the commandments that you should not do. According to the Torah, sexual relations with a woman while she is in the 7 days of nida falls into the same category as incest. This law applies to Gentile believers and Jews alike. When the apostles offered their minimum standards for Gentiles in Acts 15, they listed abstention from sexual immorality as one of those laws. The Bible's definition of sexual immorality is found in part in Leviticus 18:19, and it includes sexual relations with a woman during the 7 days after the onset of her menstrual period. So in practical terms, this means that a husband and wife should take careful note of the day on which the menstrual cycle began. They should separate for an ensuing 7 days and not reunite until the 8th day. This explains why the Jewish husbands and wives practice complete physical separation during the nida period. In Judaism, husband and wife refrain from even casual physical contact during that time. They sleep in separate beds. This clear and sharp boundary ensures that they will not transgress the prohibition on sexual contact during the nida period. So in Jewish practice, the separation period is not completed until the wife undergoes an immersion in mikvah. The immersion is a vestigial practice from the days of the temple when such immersions were necessary to remove ritual unfitness. That's all pretty simple. It gets more confusing when you look at Jewish practice of these laws. So in traditional Judaism, the period of nida abstinence is doubled as an additional. So cautionary stringency, rather than counting 7 days from the onset of menstruation, 7 days are counted from the cessation of menstruation. So until the woman has counted off 7 clean days, she is still regarded as nida. The additional period of separation for 7 clean days is stringency of Jewish practice and not something Gentile disciples need to be concerned with. Regardless of whether a family observes the biblical 7 days or the traditional 14 days, those who practice the physical separation of husband and wife during the days of nida speak highly of the positive impact that regular period of separation and abstinence has on the marriage. The marital reunion after the extended period of abstinence is sometimes described as a monthly honeymoon. Their marriage is renewed each month in ritual fitness, and the marital relations are sanctified as part of the observance of the commandment. The Zavah. Now, if a woman has discharge of her blood many days, not at the period of her menstrual impurity, or if she has a discharge beyond that period, all the days of her impure discharge, she shall continue as though in her menstrual impurity. She is unclean. Leviticus 15:25. If a woman has a discharge of blood at some time other than her monthly period of nida, or if her monthly period extends beyond that allotted 7 days of nida, it is regarded as zavah. A woman with zavah is ritually unfit and transmits ritual unfitness. In temple times, before she could return to a state of ritual fitness, she had to count up 7 clean days, immerse in living water, and then bring 2 burnt offerings, a sin offering and a burnt offering, to complete her purification. A woman with a zavah shall continue as though in her menstrual impurity. 1525. Therefore, sexual relations with a woman who had zavah are forbidden until 7 clean days from her last day of bleeding had elapsed. The pure heart. Thus you shall keep the sons of Israel separated from their uncleanness, so that they will not die in their uncleanness by their defiling my tabernacle that is among them. Leviticus 15:31. The discussion of ritually fit and unfit states begins shortly after the Torah narrates the deaths of Nadab and Abihu. The death of Aaron's 2 sons vividly dramatizes the dangers involved in entering the tabernacle. The laws of fit and unfit were designed to help ensure that the Israelites would not ritually pollute the tabernacle and die in their uncleanness by their defiling the tabernacle. That's Leviticus 15:31. So in that regard, these laws were safety measures to protect the worshippers. Today, because there is no temple, the laws of ritual fitness are not observed. However, these laws illustrate our responsibility to conduct ourselves in moral purity. We may not have to worry about whether our bodies are ritually fit or unfit, but we do have to be concerned about whether our hearts are ritually fit. The Master said this, "Blessed are the ritually fit in heart, for they will see God." Matthew 5:8. What does it mean to have a ritually fit heart? Yeshua explains that out of the heart comes evil thoughts, murders, adulteries, fornications, thefts, false witnesses, and slanders. These are the things which defile the man. Matthew 15:19 through 20. So that's something to think about for everybody. And that's about it for today. Thank you so much once again for watching. If this message blessed you, please like the video and subscribe. Again, it helps the message to reach more people who need encouragement and truth. And feel free to follow our Instagram linked in the comments for daily inspiration as well as daily prayers. May God bless you and keep you. May He shine His light on you and be gracious to you. May He turn towards you and grant you peace. Grace and shalom to you all.